Well, I will welcome us and play Helen's role today. I'm Yara Levinson. I am an assistant professor here and one of the co-conveners of the Center for Moral Education Initiative here. And I'm really pleased that we have Rob Reach here to talk to us today on adequacy and equality in K-12 education. Rob is an associate professor at Stanford in the government politics department. He is the author of Liberalism and Multiculturalism in Education, which is a terrific book that offers both a history and a philosophy of liberalism and multiculturalism and how they interact and intersect and compete with one another in especially American education. He also is working on a book on philanthropy, trying to develop a sort of basic theory of philanthropy in government, and has written on many other topics as well, homeschooling, justice in schools, other things. He does a lot of teaching outside of the university as well, including a program in prisons, right? Women's prisons?
In a drug and rehabilitation center called Hope House. They've just been released from prison and then are in this recovery facility.
And you've done that for like 5 or
10 years.
10 years now. Also was a 6th grade teacher in Houston through TFA for 2 years. And ran a summer philosophy program at Stanford for high school students, and won 2 teaching awards now at the university. Won the university's highest overall award for teaching, and also an award for undergraduate teaching. So a master educator at all levels from 6th grade through university, as well as a master political theorist. And I'm really pleased to have him here. Actually, Jennifer and Rob, why don't mind just scooching over slightly, then one you can come on in. And then I realized, Jennifer, I forgot to get your bio from you, so I'm going to say what I know, but then I should fill in other stuff.
You can just make things up. Be
fulsome in your credits.
Right, exactly. So Jennifer, you're a second-year doctoral student, right?
Right.
Yes. Okay, so Jennifer is a second-year doctoral student in the government department here. Also a political theorist, also an educator. She spent, is it 3 years teaching on an Indian reservation before coming here, and is now, to my great pleasure, not that I have anything to do with it, but both working as a political theorist and doing her dissertation, and actually with a deep understanding of the complexities of education. So I'm really pleased that she's come here. I know that you are about to do your qualifying exams.
Right.
Yes, and so I'm especially grateful that Jennifer has taken the time to come here. Is there anything else I should say?
No, that's more than enough.
Okay, all right. And I got to know Jennifer through her work with me last semester on the Justice in Schools project. And she did a masterful leading of a case study with us, and so I know that she'll do a great job also discussing. Our general norms are as follows. Rob will present for about half an hour or so, the main arguments of his paper. Jennifer has 5 or 10 minutes to respond, discuss, provoke whatever she wishes to do. If Rob wishes to respond, he can, and then ideally we'll have a good 45 minutes to have a real discussion as a group that can take the form of a Q&A or can take the form of a more freewheeling discussion. And the only other thing that I will ask is that you sign this form that I'm going to pass around because this gives evidence to the school and also to others that people come, that people care, that they are an active part of the intellectual life of the institution. With that, I'll hand it over to Rob.
Great. Mayor, do you mind if we right now just quickly go around the room just so I can hear people are relevant in the discussion? Okay, if you maybe just tell me your names and your affiliation with either the school of Ed or the university.
Bob Schwartz here.
Scott Sutter, I'm an assistant professor at the
Chris Navratsky, I used to work for the Harvard University Library.
Mary Gilbert, I'm an assistant professor.
I'm a master's student.
I'm
I'm Helen Stevens. I'm a senior at the college, and Jennifer's my thesis advisor.
Great.
My name is Vanessa Diffenbach. PK Diffenbach is in the new EDLD program, my husband.
Yeah, right.
And I actually write fiction.
And I'm Liliana Garces. I'm completing my doctoral studies here with you.
Earhart Gray, I'm a researcher at Project Zero here at the field school.
I'm the Higgins professor here.
Hi, Monica.
I'm sorry, I do it, but I teach this
Okay.
rotate person.
Molly Guerrero, I'm at the West.
And Jennifer.
And I'm Brendan Randall, a second-year doctoral student at the Ed School.
Great. Well, thanks to all of you for coming. Thank you very much to Mira for inviting me. I want to say right at the outset that the paper which I gave to Jennifer and that I'm going to talk pretty briefly about is an ongoing effort with a colleague of mine at the Stanford Law School named Bill Koski. He runs the education law clinic there. And it aspires to carry out what I think most good intellectual collaborations aspire to, which is to take something distinctive about our respective trainings and expertise and make more of what we can each do individually in something put together. And the manner in which we've tried to carry that out bears very much on the motivation for this paper, which I want to say something about right at the start before getting into the meat of it. The basic idea here, I should just announce the conclusion of the paper at the start, which is to defend a norm of equality as opposed to a norm of adequacy or sufficiency for distributing educational opportunity. And put at that level of abstraction, you might say, I really don't even understand what's at stake in saying something as simple as that. But the motivation for this comes from a real-world problem. So though I am a political philosopher and though the vast majority of political philosophy operates from considering abstract conceptions of ideals or values and understanding how they relate to one another, and then perhaps after getting a grip on that, applying them to institutional arrangements. The motivation for me to consider these two ideals, one of equality, one of adequacy, comes from a real-world problem. So the real-world problem is the following. The past 50 years of education reform or improvement in the U.S. has followed, in a really rough description, the following trajectory. The 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision was driven by an equality norm, the famous statement in the first or second paragraph of that decision, where the state undertakes to provide an education to its citizens, it must do so in a way that honors equality, provides it on an equal basis. The 1965 passage of the ESEA Act is aimed at providing targeted resources for the most disadvantaged and aspires to equalize opportunities for students. The long history in the 60s, 70s, and 80s of school finance litigation, first at the federal level, which ended with the 1973 San Antonio versus Rodriguez case, and then got shuttled down to all of the state courts, were mainly organized to try and equalize school finance. And so the early 25 years of this 50-year history really finds equality as the orienting ideal of these big picture school reform efforts. And what's being attempted to be carried out is something about equalizing school opportunities, either whether that meant integrating schools, equalizing finances into schools, or focusing resources on the most disadvantaged in order that they be lifted up in terms of their school opportunities. And then in 1989, for those legal scholars among you, there was a famous state court decision called Rose versus Kentucky, which fundamentally reorganized the provision of education in Kentucky around an ideal of sufficiency or adequacy. If you look at the Kentucky versus Rose decision, Rose versus Kentucky, whichever one it is, you'll find language that says the state has an obligation to provide enough education in order to have proficiency in certain areas, enough educational opportunities so that you can achieve a certain independence within the labor force, enough education so that you can become an independent citizen. And the norms of adequacy, rather than of equality, of there being enough opportunity rather than there being equal opportunity, really began to drive a lot of, in that, at least first instance, school finance reform. And in fact, if you look at the relatively technical literature in education law around school finance, they have this typology of the three waves of school finance reform. The initial wave at the federal level around equality that ended with San Antonio versus Rodriguez, then a second wave organized around equality, but now within state constitutions, and then a third wave, which is called quite forthrightly the adequacy movement, And that gets linked up to something I mentioned to Bob Schwartz here. I first got to know Bob when he was part of the Pew Forum for Education Reform, standards-based reform. It was really the one of the intellectual seedbeds of the standards-based standards reform movement. So the standards movement is the most recent and robust incarnation of what is really an adequacy-oriented ideal or adequacy-oriented movement, which is to say, get the states to define outcome standards at a proficient level, ensure in the ideal circumstance that there are robust opportunities for all students to reach those outcomes, and then inequalities above those proficiency outcomes are not of any significant concern to the state, so long as everyone has those sufficient outcomes. So the state is saying, essentially, to the school environment, you can be unequal so long as you're all above the sufficiency threshold. And the standards-based reform movement, I think, can be appropriately lumped in within this adequacy movement in that respect. So, the on-the-ground trajectory, on-the-ground history that I'm trying to respond to in this paper here is looking at the actual sort of historical forces that initially oriented school reform efforts around an equality ideal, and now for about 20 years, 25 years have been oriented around an adequacy ideal. And I'm trying to bring to bear the intellectual resources from within philosophy, where there has been actually a robust discussion about the conceptual difference between equality and sufficiency or equality and adequacy, to bear on the practical problem of school reform in the US. That gives you just an orientation towards the opening of the paper and why it is I thought there was something interesting to write about. And as I said before, the conclusion of the paper, the argument I'm going to try and offer by the end here, is that there is something to regret about the fixation now on adequacy, or the eclipse of equality as the orienting ideal. And while there are on-the-ground reasons to appreciate some of the achievements of the adequacy movement, and while there are lots of reasons to appreciate the strategic choices that various advocates have made in order to mount their claims, mount their efforts to advocate for increased resources in the language of adequacy, from a conceptual standpoint, I think there's something very significant lost. And I'll also try to argue that it's not really a conceptual loss, but also something that might come back to bite those of us who care about educational opportunity for children. Okay, so what I want to do is organize my initial comments into 3 different parts, having offered this initial orientation and motivation. I'm going to say something kind of technical about the conceptual distinction between equality and adequacy, drawing mainly from this philosophical literature that tries to distinguish what the philosophers tend to call equality versus sufficiency, but it's the same thing, equality versus adequacy. I'll then try to apply this initially to education and to try and give actually a case in favor of adequacy, or a kind of modified version of adequacy that I hope you might all find quite attractive. And at the end of the last section, I'll try to show why indeed equality should be preferred and is indeed superior. And then turn it over to Jennifer and then take your questions. Okay, so first, the conceptual distinction between equality and adequacy. So I tried already to signal a bit of it in my comments. Let me just read to you 2 passages from education law scholars writing in the late 1980s, early 1990s, as the adequacy movement, especially when school finance was just getting off the ground, because they signal in a very general form the difference between the 2 orienting ideals. And then I'll get into some technicalities. So this first passage is from 2 folks, Paul Minorini and Stephen Sugarman. This is a quote from a law review article. What's most distinctive about the adequacy approach is that, unlike traditional school finance cases, it does not rest on a norm of equal treatment. Indeed, the adequacy cases aren't about equality at all, except in the sense that all pupils are entitled to a high minimum. In other words, adequacy is not a matter of comparing spending of the complaining group with the spending on the others. It is rather about spending what is needed, and its focus is in some respects more on the school or on the pupil than on the district. Second quote from legal scholars Jim Ryan, and Michael Heise. They say, even successful adequacy suits, so if you sue the state for an educational violation under an adequacy ideal, the state is not providing enough education to its students, either in inputs or insufficient standards or something like that. So even a successful suit, which yields a judgment from a state Supreme Court that the legislature should provide more funding or better well-defined standards, even successful adequacy suits, presuppose that existing funding inequalities will remain. More precisely, adequacy suits abandon the idea of tying districts together financially by requiring access to equal resources. Those districts that can fund a more than adequate education are free to do so. Okay, that gives the more than an initial hint now of the conceptual distinction between equality and adequacy. The basic idea here is that equality is always and necessarily a relational ideal. We can't begin to think about what equality could mean unless we're comparing one thing to another. Equality requires us, in order to figure out how it might be conceptualized in the first place and then applied to some institutional arrangement, to say, is X equal to Y? Adequacy, by contrast, is not necessarily relational. It's something about an independent external standard that we are comparing a child, a school, a district to. So in that respect, equality is always about relative deprivation. Is X relatively deprived to Y? Whereas adequacy focuses on absolute deprivation. Are people below a standard of sufficiency such that they are fundamentally not able to do something or achieve something? Think about this in terms of the debates about global poverty. When we think about how social welfare systems might be organized in the United States, we might say people should have equal opportunity to achieve certain income levels. And globally, we think about primarily people who exist on less than $2 a day. That is a sufficiency standard focused on absolute deprivation. The thing that most calls out to our moral attention about global inequality is the number of people who exist below the absolute deprivation threshold. We're not imagining what it would mean to equalize income opportunities across the globe if there is such an aspiration that applies only internal to the country, where something like equal opportunity actually has some force. Apply that basic idea then to school finance, and you begin to get a sense of how these different debates will work themselves out. So equality is necessarily relative, adequacy is not. Equality focused on relative deprivations, relative differences between students, schools, districts, whatever the unit of analysis happens to be. Adequacy focused on some external standard of sufficiency. Okay, well, what's the upshot of that simple conceptual distinction? It should be clear right off the bat that both an equality orientation and an adequacy orientation can indeed drive us to target resources on the most disadvantaged. If some people have a lot more than the sufficiency threshold and some people have less, an equality orientation comparing X to Y is going to focus our attention on those who are relatively deprived. And so long as there are some people below the adequacy threshold, whatever that happens to be, inputs into schools, opportunities within the school environment, outcomes after school, we'll also have a reason for adequacy purposes to focus on the most disadvantaged. But only the equality orientation, the equality ideal, will focus our attention on deprivations once everyone is above the adequacy threshold. So imagine, just by way of example, for instance, if we wanted to apply the adequacy orientation only to school finance inputs, and we weren't thinking about other metrics with respect to school reform or school structure. Equality, obviously, is going to insist upon, at the very least, identical spending per student per district or something like that. You might even advance a more kind of sophisticated equality ideal in which you were trying to say we need more money for poor kids, and that's consistent with equality because what equality requires is we treat same students alike and different students differently. If you have students from different backgrounds than advantaged students, we have to drive more resources to them in order to treat them equally. But the point, again, is going to be insist upon, at the very minimum, identical funding. Whereas from an adequacy standpoint, one common thing you see developed in states is what's sometimes called a foundation guarantee within the states about funding guarantees. And the school districts which are well-to-do want to organize through property taxation or additional property tax assessments a more than adequate education. They're free to do so, and the state will sometimes sanction those inequalities above the foundation floor, which is to say that's an adequacy ideal at work rather than an equality ideal. Okay, so both equality and adequacy can target the absolutely deprived. Only equality can target the relatively deprived where everyone's above the adequacy threshold. And in that respect, both of these ideals can provide a motivation to provide equality-enhancing transfers to the disadvantaged. But again, only equality will guarantee equality-enhancing transfers to the disadvantaged when they're relatively deprived everyone above the adequacy threshold. And one more point about this, just at the level of conceptual distinction. There is oftentimes an assumption made by advocates on the ground, although less often the case amongst the philosophers, that equality is going to be way more expensive in practice than adequacy will be. And one occasional way to explain the shift from the school finance lawsuits that were driven by equality to school finance lawsuits that were driven by adequacy was that you had on the ground what's sometimes called the Robin Hood revolt. You wanted to level up the spending of school districts to something like the highest spending district of the state. The citizens in those well-to-do districts didn't want to be the Robin Hood providers for the rest of the state, and you had blowback, political blowback, which made adequacy a more appealing one because it was less expensive. It took less dollars to achieve adequacy. It would have been more to achieve equality. So on the ground, oftentimes there's this expectation that we shifted away from equality because it was very financially demanding with this difficult political dimension. But at a conceptual level, adequacy is just as capable of being more expensive than equality for the following reason. Imagine, just in terms of stylizing an example for you, that the adequacy threshold of something is 100 units, inputs, outputs, whatever it happens to be. Currently, people only have 10 and 12 of them. To get everyone to adequacy would be to drive resources from the 10 and 12 all the way up to 100. It would cost a lot of money. To make people equal, if someone has 10 and another person has 12, would be to give 2 more units of whatever that resource is to the person with 10, and now equality obtains between those 2 people. So depending on how we peg what sufficiency is, it can actually turn out to be a far more financially demanding, and in certain respects, therefore politically demanding aspiration than equality. All of that is to offer some conceptual groundwork to help you wade through the thicket of actual on-the-ground school policy proposals. And maybe here's a good time to signal to you something about my ultimate argument in favor of equality, something I worry about, which I think oftentimes doesn't get enough attention. If it's true that on the ground there was this political blowback from, relatively speaking, well-to-do districts about an equality aspiration within school finance reform, don't steal from our property taxation values to fund other students all the way up to our level. It's also true that at least as the actual wording exists of the No Child Left Behind legislation, that someone who's more fluent in the actual details of this can fill me in, Bob, maybe that person is you. All children in the United States will achieve to the state proficiency standards by the year 2014. That's the idea of No Child Left Behind. Imagine what the marginal cost is of getting the last child to the proficiency standard. My suggestion to you is it's the entire state budget for everything. And you probably still don't get there. The equality ideal, in its grandest aspiration, might be something like find the highest spending school district and level everyone up. That's not the entirety of the state budget. That's something less than the entirety of the state budget. As the No Child Left Behind legislation is actually written, it would siphon off everything, I think, in states actually to attempt to make it happen. In any case, again, that relates to this conceptual distinction. Okay, now, one thing further to say about the conceptual distinction that I'm going to apply it to education is that because equality is necessarily about these relative comparisons and adequacy is not, one of the things which people often say against equality that will not be a problem with adequacy is that people who defend equality are subject to what's often called the leveling down phenomenon. You can satisfy an equality orientation not by leveling the lowest spending district up to the highest spending district, but by lowering down the highest spending district to the lowest spending district. Or as happened in actual civil rights reform cases, local municipality makes available a public swimming pool that is whites only. There's a lawsuit brought on the basis of equality that if you spend public money to provide a facility for all citizens, but narrow them only to, restricted only to whites. One solution that some municipalities came up with to fight against those lawsuits was to eliminate swimming pools entirely. We satisfy the equality ideal by not providing the public service at all. Everyone has nothing, essentially. That's a perfect example of the leveling down phenomenon, leveling down to actually no public provision of some particular resource. In California, where I come from, the leveling down phenomenon is a real phenomenon. My off-the-cuff suggestion to you would be that that's driven at least in large part by the Prop 13 cap, not something to do internal to a debate between equality and adequacy. But this is not merely a conceptual worry, it's an on-the-ground worry that if you're going to plump for equality, as I am, you want to avoid leveling down and insist on leveling up. The problem is, as a strict conceptual matter, you can't insert into an equality argument the necessity of leveling up, because as a strict conceptual matter, it can be satisfied also by leveling down. As I said, that was something to tell in favor of adequacy. If we decide that adequacy is some threshold level of inputs or outputs, there's no leveling down or leveling up. We've got our targeted level of sufficiency or adequacy, and that's what we have to get to. Okay, let me stop with that and then go to the second section, which is to apply these two ideals to education reform questions. I already tried to suggest to you the historical trajectory in which these ideals have been at work. Let me then say something about how these things play out in some current debates. There have been a couple of recent arguments made mainly by some philosophers, and less here now by education advocates, who have tried to develop an adequacy, defense of an adequacy ideal within educational distribution that's driven by a civic aspiration of equal standing. So here's the most direct connection I can make for you to the title of this colloquium about civic and moral education. The basic idea goes as following. The state's interest in the provision of K-12 education rests in its aspiration to make people into equal citizens, where what's important about equal citizenship is one's standing to other citizens. So there's the relational ideal of equality at work. And what we're trying to do is make sure that there is no such thing as a second tier or third tier class of citizens. And educational opportunity is going to be very important for the aspiration to achieve equal standing as a citizen. What follows from this civic equality standpoint, however, is what several philosophers call a sufficientarian or an adequacy principle of distribution. If what you seek to achieve is equal standing as a citizen, the distributional principle governing the material distributional consequences of implications of educational opportunity is merely sufficiency. So let me read you a passage from a wonderful political philosopher named Elizabeth Anderson, who teaches at Michigan. She writes the following: democratic equality is egalitarian in its conception of just relationships among citizens, but sufficientarian in its conception of justice in the distribution of resources and opportunities. What's important is not that everyone has equal opportunities to acquire resources and fulfilling jobs, but that everyone has enough. The ideal of democratic equality specifies how much this is, enough to secure the conditions of citizens' freedom and civic status as an equal to other citizens. On this view, as long as everyone has enough to function as an equal, inequalities beyond this threshold are not of particular concern. You see the implications pretty quickly for educational opportunity. Equal standing as a citizen is not threatened with inequalities in educational opportunity so long as those at the bottom of the distribution in terms of the educational opportunities are not always relegated to a second-class citizen status. Anderson is what you would call an egalitarian with respect to citizenship, a sufficientarian or an adequatarian is way too infelicitous a phrase, but an adequacy defender with respect to distribution. And in fact, she's defended adequacy in educational distribution for precisely the reasons I just described. One interesting and additional modification to Anderson's argument has come from a colleague of mine in the philosophy department, Deborah Satz. She's tried to take the Anderson view, which is to say what's most important about the state's obligation to provide educational opportunity in the first place is to accomplish equal standing as a citizen. And then to say, in order to identify what would be adequate opportunity, we have to always have what she calls a dynamic view about where the adequacy level is pegged along with how much the top end of the distribution is achieving. So, for instance, imagine we set the adequacy threshold of educational opportunity at Mississippi's proficiency standards. We know that Massachusetts proficiency standards are the best in the country. It will be a predictable outcome if we have that different setting, that Mississippi students will have systematically better opportunities post-secondary education than Mississippi students through the mechanism of the state's actions, not from private background efforts, because of the different levels of resources and expectations that are provided for education. If that difference were to translate into essentially predictable stratification with massive gaps in income and life opportunities across groups of people, Anderson and Satz might say, well, civic standing as an equal standing as a citizen has now been undermined because the opportunities for civic involvement that are created through these different adequacy orientations in these two different states undermine a national citizenship standard. And for that reason, dynamically, so long as we have the top end of the distribution going through the roof, it's not exactly happening in Massachusetts, but imagine it were, you would get from Satz's point of view, my colleague at Stanford, a reason to begin to push up the adequacy threshold in order that there never be such a massive gap between wherever the adequacy threshold is and what the top end of the distribution is getting or doing or achieving. Okay, so that relates to the most sympathetic argument I can mount on behalf of an adequacy ideal, which is to say, build in some dynamic relationship between what the top end of the distribution is doing, so we're always trying to question whether or not equal standing as a citizen is being threatened, always constantly try to push it up so that we're not getting cast like stratification within life chances and labor market outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. We'll have a principle of distribution adequacy that's quite defensible. What I want to suggest to you in the final couple of minutes of my presentation is that that's still not enough, ironically. Adequacy is inadequate, would be the short quick here to give you. The reason for that is the following. The Anderson and Satz argument begins from the premise, which I said just before, that the state's interest in providing education opportunity in the first place is related to promoting equal citizenship. And what I want to suggest is that while that is indeed an important reason for the state's massive investments in educational opportunity, it's not the only reason. And the further reason the state has to care about educational opportunity is that there are massive private returns to education, not related to citizenship. We all know that the more education you get, the better your labor market opportunities are. We all know that the more education you get, with the exception of getting a PhD, your income goes up. And if the state has an interest in providing something along the lines of what you would call equality of opportunity, a robust form of social mobility, if you wanted to be specific about this, Rawlsian fair equality of opportunity, a much more stringent standard, but leave it at a more minimum one, simple equality of opportunity. If we have a system of school provision, which is indeed meeting an adequacy standard, even an adequacy standard like the one that Anderson and Satz have described, but we still have predictable differences in how it is that students are getting into college because of inequalities above the threshold and then obtaining positions within the labor market, we're going to have something to worry about. I think the state will have something to worry about because the state has a proper obligation, I believe, to regulate educational opportunity to ensure something like fair competition for scarce resources of admission to selective universities, scarce resources for the ability to obtain a well-paying job. So since the state, I think, has obligations to provide education that go beyond citizenship to regulate the private returns education, I want to try and suggest to you that the equality orientation is the only ideal only ideal up to the task to govern that particular private return. And I want to introduce the last sort of piece of the argument here, the last cog in the argumentative wheel, that we have to understand educational opportunity, especially in secondary schooling, as something economists often call a positional good, which is to say, what's valuable about education is not merely what attainment level you get, but where you stand in the distribution of that particular good. Let me give you some technical language about that. The phrase positional good comes from a British economist named Fred Hirsch, and he had a nice quip for it. Let me get it for you. So the key here to understand this is that positional goods fuse the notion of absolute and relative value. The absolute value of the good a person holds, to the extent that it is positional, can only be determined by referring to the standing in the distribution of that good. Positional goods are competitive goods and valued as a means to achieving some other end or goal. So, for example, Hirsch has this quip: if everyone stands on tiptoe, no one can see any better. Everyone has raised in their height. So if we're concerned about absolute attainment of height, if everyone goes on tiptoe, everyone is, absolutely speaking, taller. But no one can see any better. That's, I suggest to you, actually what's going on very strongly in the private returns education. If we have a school environment in which selective admissions to universities and the ability to win a position in the labor market is determined by, do you fall in the top 10% of the educational distribution of achievement, education is going to be very, very strongly positional. Even if we set adequacy thresholds of outcomes at a very high rate, if there are tell me if I've got the reference points right here, Mira, if there are the Newtons of the world constantly pushing their students to higher and higher levels of achievement relative to the Brookline or Cambridge students, systematically giving them better opportunities to compete for admissions to Harvard or Stanford, and therefore systematically giving them better opportunities to win the highest paying jobs in the labor market, everyone will be at a threshold of equality, a threshold of adequacy in terms of outcomes. But because education is very strongly a positional good, we will see Newton students winning the positional competitions for selective opportunities, scarce resources, regularly and systematically. And my claim is that adequacy is incapable of addressing that particular problem, and only equality can get you there. So let me give you a really simple illustration of this problem. I gave it already with the Newton example. The local reference points for me, for those of you who've been out in the Bay Area, are something like Palo Alto and Woodside versus where I live in Redwood City or Mountain View or something. Redwood City and Mountain View, relative to California, are doing quite well. It would be hard for anyone to mount an argument that they're below some adequacy threshold in terms of either inputs or of outcomes. But they're nowhere near what Palo Alto and Woodside provide, either in terms of inputs or outcomes. Do you think there is some moral complaint to be lodged if it turns out to be the case that Palo Alto and Woodside graduates have systematically better opportunities to compete for these scarce positions in admissions to higher ed and labor markets, as opposed to the Redwood City and Mountain View students? Now, I want to suggest to you there is some moral complaint to be lodged there. It wouldn't rise to the top of the agenda of public policy to target it. But is there some moral complaint to worry about? Yes. I think the adequacy defender finds no reason to complain, because from the Anderson and Satz point of view, is equal standing as a citizen threatened when the student from Redwood City or Mountain View goes on in life and the student in Palo Alto and Woodside goes on in life? Really hard to suggest that equal standing as a citizen is undermined. But these private returns to education in terms of college admissions and labor market, I think, will see systematic stratification. That's amplified, just incidentally, because I think Jennifer wants to make a comment about this in a couple of things she shared on the blog, by this widespread and growing phenomenon, certainly in California, probably also around here, for parents really concerned to maintain the advantages that their children have to make private contributions to the public schoolhouse through school auctions or school foundations or local education funds. And Woodside parents and Palo Alto parents contribute, I don't kid you here, somewhere on a range between $1,000 and $3,000 per student per year to supplement the public funding of those school districts. So when you allow that also into the equation, you're going to see, as I say before, systematic differences in what people end up doing with the scarce opportunities later on, and only equality can target that. Okay, so let me wrap things up here. The basic line I want to argue to you in conclusion is that while I can understand at a strategic level, if you're a Michael Rebell in New York and you're trying to strategically find your way to win more resources on behalf of disadvantaged students, I have no quibble with someone who wants to hang their hat on an adequacy orientation because the equality debate sort of ran its course and there's fewer legal books available. But I worry very much that short-run successes for Michael Rebell that then inscribe into law an adequacy orientation, so long as the state has given robust opportunities for students to achieve up to an adequacy orientation, whether that means proficiency standards at a high level or equal standing as a citizen, we will have then given no conceptual leverage to the state to target inequalities above that high proficiency threshold. And the state will lose a lever that long run will, I think, come back to bite those of us who care about the fates of poor and disadvantaged children. Why is that? That's because since parents quite naturally see educational opportunity as one of the primary vehicles to gain advantages for their children in these competitions into selected universities and to occupy middle class or upper middle class positions in the labor market, those who live in Newton or those who live in Woodside, under even the most robust adequacy program, the most highly successful adequacy program, will want to preserve the advantages they currently possess where there are low-performing schools and only ratchet up their investments in either their public school districts or in their private attempts to provide for their children. So over the long haul, one dynamic that might be that you might say, I'd be happy to see that, raise the floor up, make the Woodsides and Newtons of the world hyper-concerned about preserving their advantage and make them go even higher. Yes, their absolute attainments of everyone will grow, but what will be the effect within selected college admissions? The labor market will still see those advantages systematically cemented, baked into the opportunity structure, and now the state will have no conceptual leverage to complain about it. That's what I worry is the middle run, long run consequence of having adequacy as the orienting ideal of school reform. Let me stop there, turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so one of the more useful ways that political theory takes on the muddle that is the world of political practice is by boiling down historical events into different concepts which end up being incongruous with one another, vastly oversimplified in order to show just how complicated everything is. Done well, such a method can be quite illuminating, and Professor Wright, your argument is indeed an illustration of this method done well. But I wanted to challenge you on a few of your conceptual simplifications, because doing so shows that things are even messier than they seem, which, far from being damaging to your argument, just goes to show how much in need of conceptual clarification today's educational debates are. Okay, so to sum up my understanding of your arguments in 8 words, historically, equality versus adequacy. Adequacy won, equality better. I actually tried to make a haiku out of that, but it was very difficult with all the syllables. So I completely agree with your history when you say that in the era of Brown v. Board, educational debates were all about equality. But I would argue against your characterization of present-day educational debates as operating within an adequacy framework for 2 reasons. So first of all, from the top down, I believe that there's actually a confused admixture of adequacy talk and equality talk, depending on who you talk to. And second, from the bottom up, I believe that there's actually more equality talk than adequacy talk. All in all, as I see it, you're right that the shift from equality to adequacy began in 1971, but I think that there's been at least a partial shift back to equality. And what I think your paper can do is ally with the equality people against the adequacy people and bring adequacy down. I never actually knew that adequacy was such an enemy, but I have to say, upon reading your paper, I'm completely persuaded. Okay, so let me attempt to defend those two claims I just made. So first, taking the top-down purview, as I see it, there's invisible, somewhat overlapping frameworks of equality and adequacy, which elected officials and educational bureaucrats constantly move back and forth between, sometimes even within the same piece of legislation, publication, or press release. No Child Left Behind, which you put forward as proof that adequacy has triumphed, is actually the perfect illustration of what I'm talking about. Yes, I see how conceptually NCLB can be interpreted as paradigmatic of the adequacy framework. NCLB lets states set their own proficiency measures, which students have to meet. If every student in the country is proficient, that's enough, that's adequate. However, the politics of NCLB enactment had everything to do with equality. If you watch the C-SPAN videos, it's apparent that the rhetoric surrounding the bill was about, quote, the needy, about how poverty should not be determinative of one's educational or life prospects. The goal of, quote, closing the achievement gap between high and low performing children, especially the achievement gaps between minority and non-minority students, and between disadvantaged children and their more advantaged peers, is directly from Title I of NCLB, resonated with so many that NCLB became law with overwhelming bipartisan support. In fact, even the imagery of leaving no child behind implies that there's this pack of kids, presumably running towards college degrees and competitiveness in the skilled labor market, and there are some who, due to poverty, due to race or class discrimination, due to the failure of schools to provide services for students with exceptional needs, just aren't caught up with this pack. There aren't supposed to be students left behind that way, and this seems like an equality issue to me. Now, maybe for expository reasons, for the sake of brevity, or because you disagree with me, you reject this idea that both equality and adequacy are at play in the federal educational policy of the past decade. That's fine, and I won't get my feelings hurt if you don't like my suggestion. However, in this case, I wonder, why NCLB and not Race to the Top? When it comes to both its political rhetoric and its agenda, it's clear that the main selling point of Race to the Top was that it was about excellence, especially in relation to other countries. Isn't, in a sort of profound way, excellence really about adequacy? After all, as long as we have enough students scoring high enough on the P's and the T's, does it matter for global competitiveness what the other students are doing or learning? And can't similar remarks be made about a nation at risk whose rhetoric, no doubt, informed the school finance debates that occurred during what you conceptualized as the second wave? Okay, so let me move on to my second and final point, namely that in the present day, at the level of the community and the individual school, this is a bottom-up rather than top-down purview, the equality paradigm has already superseded the adequacy paradigm. In many schools in low-income communities, public, private, magnet, or charter, there's already a robust discourse among parents, teachers, administrators, and students that is about going to college and getting a good job, about overcoming the obstacles associated with poverty. These folks know that there are more challenges in their community than in mid or high-income communities. Yet they want more than anything from these economic challenges they want to prevent these economic challenges from becoming educational disadvantages. These folks know that there's a strong connection, as you said, between educational attainment and opportunities available later on in life. And these folks want equal opportunities. This is not a discourse about adequacy. Students in these schools aren't there to just learn the 3 R's because the 3 R's aren't enough to make it in the world in which we live. It's a discourse about justice. It's a discourse about equality. In fact, I heard this discourse with my own ears, and I participated in it before I quit my teaching job in order to study political theory, which doesn't exactly mean that you should just assume everything I'm saying is true. In fact, what I'm calling for probably calls for empirical research that doesn't exist yet. But I nevertheless encourage you to think through what this equality-adequacy dichotomy looks like on the ground. School finance lawsuits, alas, are one level of abstraction away from the conversations that students, parents, and teachers are having amongst themselves. Bringing in the latter dimension has the potential to enrich your already quite rich analysis.
Thanks.
So,
Oh, sorry.
okay. Yeah, let me just end on a note of optimism. I agree with you that adequacy is inadequate and that equality is awesome. But in my opinion, the equality paradigm did not die its final death in the 1970s. It's back, it's alive and well in low-income schools, and had trickled up into policy talks as early as January 2002 with the passage of NCLB. And I think your paper could share my optimism if you'd be willing to back away from your, albeit elegant, expository structure of first equality, then adequacy, now what?
Okay. Right. Thanks a lot for those comments.
Can I ask you just to hold on a sec while I change the tape?
Sure. Give me time to organize what I want to say.
Okay.
I could compose some more haikus in the meantime.
Equality is alive and well in present-day debates in one place that you mentioned, in discussions about the achievement gap. So when people articulate their concerns for school reform in the language of worrying about the achievement gap, that is a paradigmatically egalitarian worry or concern. It's that classic relational comparison. We're worried about the achievement of one group of students as opposed to another group of students. We're comparing student to student, school to school, district to district. It is indeed the place where equality is alive and well. But I would resist the rereading your characterization you want to offer of No Child Left Behind as an equality aspiration for the following reason. So as I tried to lay out at a conceptual level, if we have the lowest achieving group of students, we focus our attention on them, whether they're poor or disadvantaged in some other dimension. So long as those students are below an adequacy threshold of outcomes or opportunities or inputs into the school, both the equality ideal and the adequacy ideal are going to guide us to those students. The equality ideal will guide us to those students because they're low end of the distribution, so they are achieving at the lowest or have the fewest opportunities relative to other people. The adequacy ideal will guide us to those students because they're not up to the adequacy threshold of whatever it is we're seeking. So both those ideals are equally capable of focusing our attention on the most disadvantaged. However, No Child Left Behind does so through an adequacy orientation, not through an equality orientation, because it speaks quite forthrightly about these proficiency standards, imagining, not merely imagining, I think specifying, that those students who are achieving above the proficiency standards, those students who exist in districts who are spending more than is what is, technically speaking, required to get to the proficiency standards, will not trigger any state violation. The concern is to get everyone to flip the floor up to the adequacy threshold and then be officially indifferent to achievement or opportunity above it. That's where only the egalitarian ideal is going to be able to do some work. The adequacy ideal gives out, and I think for those reasons, No Child Left Behind gives out if we got to that magical outcome where every student was actually achieving at a high proficiency level. So I think the reason why one might imagine the response you gave is that for the most disadvantaged in our current real-world environment, students are both relatively deprived and absolutely deprived, and equality and adequacy will focus our attention on them. But only equality, as I tried to explain, was going to give us reason from the state to worry about inequalities above even an adequacy threshold. My worry, as I said before, is that we're hard baking into legislation and into state court decisions the adequacy ideal as the governing ideal for educational distribution, not equality. Mira, maybe how should you want to call on people or?
Sure, yeah,
Great.
fine.
It sounds like the difference in attaining here is really, if you think about it from the motivation versus the execution. So clearly, people are motivated to reduce inequalities. But the execution of it, I mean, basically you're saying it's unfortunately undermining in some ways, or potentially undermining what it set out to solve. But the motivation is alive and well. Is that possible?
The language I want to use, and I grant this is perhaps idiosyncratic, is everyone's motivated by inequity concerns.
Yeah.
To diminish the space at the moment between those who are doing well and those who are doing poorly. But if you were to raise people up, lift the floor of opportunity, achievement, again, whatever it is, up, only the equality ideal is going to give you a continuing reason to care about inequalities above that threshold. Inequalities between Newton and wherever, even when those inequalities systematically translate into stratification into the scarce positions that we think ought to be governed by equality of opportunity.
I think what you two pointed out at the end there is very engaging for me because I think there is, as you pointed out, a certain amount of political sleight of hand going on in the rhetoric underlying No Child Left Behind, in that it is justified in an idea of closing the gap, yet as you, I think, eloquently point out, the framework really isn't focused on a gap question. You can meet the goals of NCLB without closing a gap. And it makes me also wonder, though, too, what the gap means for some people. I think that also may be a term that has multiple meanings. For people who I think are on your page, which I would include myself, it's a positional question.
Right.
I think for others, though, it's really a question of proficiency. The gap question is X number of our students are proficient, Y numbers of those students are proficient. If we can get Y up to X, we're fine. And I think that complicates it, even when people say they're concerned about the gap. I think we have to interrogate, well, exactly what gap are you talking about?
Right. Someone told me recently, this was Richard Rothstein, who points out a lot of the things he writes, that if we look at NAEP scores, I won't be able to reproduce the precise details of this, but it goes something like this, that if we look at NAEP scores for 4th and 8th grade reading and math, and we looked at them back in the 1970s or 80s, the absolute levels of achievement on those NAEP tests for African Americans versus white students, there was indeed a big gap. But today, where white students were in the late 1970s in 4th grade math and reading is where African American students are today. There's still a gap because white students have also improved their performance on the test. And if we thought that where white students were performing in 1979, whatever it was adequate achievement, well then, we're done. The thing that was concerning with achievement gap from an adequacy standpoint is taken care of. The egalitarian still has a worry.
So I want to question whether there is such a thing in the United States, or at least in the way you described it, as a commitment to equality. Because it seems to me there's a commitment to what people call equality of opportunity, but certainly not equality of outcome.
Right.
And so isn't equality of opportunity in some ways just another way of talking about adequacy?
Yeah. So one very simplistic response initially to that is that, just the phrase equality of opportunity has within it, of course, the aspiration to equality. We have to specify what it is that equality of opportunity might mean. And while there might be certain ways to think about educational dimensions of education that are appropriately packaged into equal outcomes, I don't think there's anyone who's a serious defender about looking for equal outcomes, whether it's in terms of achievement. We don't actually want equal outcomes in education. The egalitarian norm, when applied to educational arrangements, is not going to have its strongest fight in an outcome dimension. It's going to have its strongest fight in an opportunity dimension, because it's not a lovely ideal to imagine that at the end of high school, everyone has the same grade point average. We're looking for differences in achievement, and in order that we can, well, let me just put it differently. We're not purposely looking for differences in achievement. We're allowing for differences in achievement to arise, but hopefully, in my view, only because indeed equal opportunities have been made available to all to make use of the state resources.
See, I can't go there with you because when we talk about equality of opportunity, we're not talking about the fact that within the school there are parents who have enough money to hire tutors
Right.
and give you a chance to go to Europe.
That's right.
Right, so the opportunities are in fact not equal.
Exactly.
Which is why I think that whenever we talk about equality in this country, we are really talking about adequacy, that we don't actually believe in equality.
Yep.
We believe in adequacy. And sometimes we call it equality, and sometimes we call it adequacy. And maybe we're more generous when we call it equality, but it doesn't really mean that
Sure.
we're interested in equality.
Right. So tell me if you would accept the following amended description. For the very reasons you described, namely that all kinds of things go on in what is so-called private life that will predictably and reliably generate inequalities of opportunity.
Well, and inequalities of outcome.
And inequalities of outcome. But I also mean inequalities of opportunity. Just what you said, people will hire private tutors,
Right.
they'll get the application, they'll do all differences in socioeconomic standing will provide differences in opportunity. And because either we are unwilling to eradicate those differences at the state, or because it is in certain respects impossible to eradicate those differences and opportunities that are generated in the private sphere, we're led to what you just described, which is all we're ever going to get is adequacy of opportunity, not equality of opportunity. So my resistance to that, my redescription of what you just described would be to say, as a political philosopher, you need to mount two different kinds of arguments. One as applied to what norm is going to guide state institutions, and another that's going to guide how the state can intervene or not within private life. And because what I described here are public school environments, if we're going to allow the more intrusive or invasive ideal of equality of opportunity to govern the operation of the school system, to govern the operation of life opportunities. It's the best chance we have for it to get a toehold is going to be within state institutions. And we'll have to give different arguments to someone to say, you mean you're not going to let me hire with my own resources a private tutor to try and preserve advantages? Now we might go there. We can point to the estate tax as one effort to travel at least a little bit of a distance to something like equality of opportunity. But the kinds of arguments you need as a philosopher to justify those types of interventions seem to me of a different order than the kinds you need to justify how the state's own institutions and agencies are operating. So that's especially when I talk to my colleague Deborah Satzer or Elizabeth Anderson, I say, we already, for the reasons you said, we're already in the real world consigned to adequacy of opportunity. And now you want to give up on the state institution as the place to try and push forward with equality too? You really want a sufficientarian principal distribution even for the public school? And if there's any leverage in the current political environment or even within general liberal democratic theory for pushing as hard as you can an equality aspiration, well, it's going to have its greatest fight, it seems to me, in the state's own institutions. So the real world outcome is going to be what you described, Lonnie. I think we're never going to be able to eradicate all those background sources of inequality. But we don't have to give up on the state institution.
Yeah, I'm still not convinced because I think that you said it's always that equality is always a relational ideal.
Yeah.
And so, as far as I can tell, the relationship is not actually between two people, it's between outcomes, which is going back to your adequacy argument. So we're not trying to create equality between two people because we come to the conversation with a commitment, a pre-commitment that these two people are actually not the same. And that one has greater brain power or one has more musical talent.
Mm-hmm.
That is, we tend to think of that as proprietary and inside of the individual.
Exactly, right. Well, I think the relational ideal is working. We're comparing your child to my child and the opportunities that he or she will have over the course of a life to develop their talents, pursue their interests, compete on a fair basis for scarce opportunities like college admissions or labor market outcomes, and indeed to become hopefully equal standing as a citizen. And if the source of inequalities in standing or in opportunities is generated from the public school environment as opposed to these supposedly more private things, I want to insist upon the egalitarian ideal for the school environment. And I might even travel some distance to try and make it do some work within, again, this is supposedly background private sphere. Again, I just think the arguments to do so are going to look different.
No, so I'm not saying that I agree with your colleague, but for example, you compare Mountain View to Palo Alto.
Right.
So is that private or is that public?
That's public.
Well, but
Because I'm comparing the public school systems in the two places.
right, but we have a system for creating wealth for different public schools based on property taxes.
Absolutely.
And therefore, if Mountain View or Palo Alto decides that it's not going to allow certain kinds of housing to be built in that community, right, it can make all of these decisions that we say are quote public decisions, but it's actually in many ways very private.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're trying to keep a public space inaccessible.
And for that reason, I would want to begin to.
So you would go as far as changing the tax structure as to how you create subsidized education, so that Mountain View would have the same teachers, the same.
Yes. I mean, or to be very specific, on occasion I get asked, what's the one change you might, whip about to bring about improvements in school reform or achievement for disadvantaged children. And I say, Milliken versus Bradley, which established some moral significance to school district boundaries, these units that we generate the overall structure of school opportunity. Terrible decision, and that the creation of the supposed governance units that we have now is wholly arbitrary, or at the very least, it's an artifact of the state's power. We could change that, and I would absolutely seek to undo what we currently have.
And do you think there would be support for that?
Well, that I'm not going to say.
That's the part that I'm.
Right.
So that's where.
Yeah.
I hear what you're saying, but I feel that in some ways you are optimizing our culture in a direction that it will never go.
Yeah, well, this is the constant tension for a philosopher who wants to take some cues from the real world environment. So to stay tethered enough that you're not really just off in utopia.
Right.
And what are you taking for granted and what are you not taking for granted? Right. So, I accept everything you say and just want to reflect that it's the predicament of a philosopher in general who has this aspiration.
Okay.
Yeah.
Open it, Scott.
I was just curious. I should preface by saying I'm not actually used to talking so conceptually, so I'm trying very hard to understand. I found your sort of argument for equality quite interesting. Like Jennifer, as you referenced, kind of there were sort of external comparisons with other countries, like the TIMS and the PISA. And I guess I was curious, like, if your argument sort of for equality works best if you think about the United States in isolation without kind of thinking, because I guess you kind of you sort of made these reference points, like in Massachusetts, you sort of said the Newton versus, say, the Boston or the Cambridge, and I guess if you're as an educator, you're concerned and confident that the instruction in the Newtons is actually quite poor as well. It's just that the Newtons are not transformative educational environments either. It's just that the students are coming in on a higher trajectory and leaving on that same trajectory. I guess I wonder if, like, the equality argument you're putting forward, like, it doesn't really do much in terms of improving sort of education writ large in the United States in a global context.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, because the starting place for the entire enterprise of the paper is to think about what ideal or principle should govern the distribution of educational opportunity in primary and secondary schools? And since there is no governing institution at the global level that's actually parceling out educational opportunity in different places, I get no real-world institutional foothold to get my project up and running. We have national units that are distributing educational opportunity, and then comparing them across groups yields inequalities, and maybe for all the reasons you just described, we have good reason here to try and push achievement up, push excellence at the top, so that our best students are as good as or better than some other countries' best students. But that's, as I say, I don't have the apparatus in this particular paper to get a grip on that, because I'm trying to identify a governing unit, a state, is trying to figure out how it should distribute educational opportunity in primary and secondary schools. It could do it on the basis of adequacy, it could do it on the basis of equality, or it could do it on the basis of efficiency or of excellence. I've just tried to focus on two ideals, whereas the global comparisons you just identified don't have a supra governance unit that's distributing those opportunities.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I guess it's interesting. Like, so I mean, for you, you sort of distribution is the key. Distribution is the key issue, and I guess it occurs to me. I guess I sort of think of it, not say just in terms of capacity, right? Like that like it seems like the international comparisons would suggest that like the capacity of the current is like the United States' current capacity is actually not adequate.
Yeah.
Like and I guess I wonder if and interesting, I mean, like President Obama is really sort of speaking in global terms with this kind of in the future. Like I wonder if
that's the language of the day.
Right. Like I wonder, but I guess I wonder if the adequacy argument, like in terms of no one writ large is adequate. Like the Newtons aren't adequate. I wonder if that would be more helpful in terms of building capacity.
Right. I mean, so this is the sense in which I sometimes think the folks who, like Michael Rebell, who are motivated to win judgments in state courts or to have legislatures push through laws that are going to try and push up the achievement of, at the very least, the most disadvantaged students, but perhaps more optimistically, everyone, and therefore, at an absolute level, achievement goes up. Totally worthy ideal. I'm not against that. But this sense in which education is positional, and if we reliably have a group of students achieving more than the ways in which the competitions sort themselves out later on, just in the ways in which we worry about it in the international context, if the Singapores of the world produce all of the innovative engineers who will be left behind, we should worry about the top end of the distribution, that no one from the U.S. will be competitive. But so one last observation about these global comparisons. Whereas I think it makes a certain amount of sense to say that with respect to educational opportunity within a particular governance unit, the U.S. or one other state, you want to have competition on the basis of fairness. You want people to have an opportunity to compete on a fair basis. If there's unfair competition across the world, actually that seems to be what people are going for. Can Singapore preserve its systematic advantage on unfair terms with respect to other countries, or whatever it happens to be? Since there is no governance unit seeking fairness, there's no way to get that conversation up and running.
Can I press Scott's point a little further, though? Because it's true that there's no supranational institution to distribute resources among countries. But what I've heard Scott's point as being partly that if the comparison point is one country to another, then the within nation distribution gets radically transformed, so that no longer, say, is Newton or Palo Alto the reference point, right?
Yeah.
And so this is the point that you made with the 10 and 12 units versus 100 units, right?
Yep.
And what I hear Scott's point is being, we really need to normalize the 100 units and recognize that we're at 10 or 12 units. And so therefore that actually does have an impact on internal distribution policy that's quite considerable.
Right.
Well, and also everyone's standing on their tiptoes point makes a big difference, right? That really helps if the reference point is external.
And I think that builds on Lonnie's point, which is, when you look at the positional good argument from economics, we can have fair competition for scarce resources, yet still result in a wide distribution of those resources.
Correct.
So if your real ultimate concern is positional goods, is that really the problem? Or is the problem that we have a system in which positional goods are inherited? If your parents were high on the distribution scale, you are likely to be high. But if we had a system which had fair competition and every generation mixed it,
Right.
would that satisfy your concerns? So we still have gross distribution, but it's not tied to a hereditary advantage.
What do you mean by gross distribution?
Or I mean, you still have a wide disparity of distribution.
Right.
You know, we're not having equality of outcome.
Right.
But, so I'm trying to tease out what's the real danger here to citizenship. Is it that we have vast disparity of positional outcome? Or that there is a real commonality to where your parents and grandparents were is highly determinative of where you're going to be?
Well, I agree entirely with that, the last point, that if we're thinking about how to explain the distribution of opportunities and then the actual positions people occupy in that distribution, we're going to look very, very closely at things that happen within the family, things that happen outside the sphere of the state. And in that respect, this paper is confining itself to the ideal that ought to govern educational opportunity in the schoolhouse, not educational opportunity writ large and all the different factors that go into it. One way to put this, I think this is a fair thing to say, that the outcome imagined from so if the egalitarian aspiration I've defended here were actually at work in a successful way in the distribution of opportunity in the public school system, we would have a more crystalline meritocracy. The things that were determining differences in outcome in the opportunity structure would no longer be from the state's institutions, but would be from all the things you just described, including natural talents and the way that people then made use of them. Now, you might have objections to having a more crystalline meritocracy.
Or you might have objections to a meritocracy.
Or you may have objections to meritocracy. That's right. Then we should have a conversation about that. But what I'm trying to make happen here in certain respects is to make sure that the state's apparatus itself will not have contributed to positional advantages over and above what's already going on in the background. And it's not that I think the state should be indifferent to what's going on in the background. It's that I think, as I said to Lonnie before, the arguments you need to make as a political philosopher to govern the types of interventions you want to do within the background environment are going to be of a different kind than the arguments you're going to give to govern the distribution of the opportunity within the state institutions themselves.
No, that clarifies it for me immensely. Thank you.
So in that case, you wouldn't take responsibility for what happened with busing here in Boston, which is that we offered an equality policy of the redistribution of people across the school district, and then all of the white families took their kids out, put them in private schools, and so you saw that they just left the system.
Yep. Take responsibility for it. So if what you mean by that is did the equality inspired program?
Just to quickly clarify, it's because you're talking about the state provision of the good, and once they leave the system where the state is providing the good, then
just as I said with Lonnie, do I want to take the school district configuration as a given, or imagine that we could reconstruct it in some different way? I mean, so the ideal theorist in me wants to say we could find a much better way of delivering the governance units of school opportunity. If I were an advocate on the ground reading my paper, I would want to be highly attuned to unintended consequences of an egalitarian-inspired reform program. And one that Mayura mentioned to me at lunch that I think is a natural thing to be concerned about is that if parents are worried about now an equality ideal governing the distribution of educational opportunity, and we allow still private schools, then we'll just might see an exit to private school arrangements, and they continue to purchase preserve their advantage to the private school world. And it might be better off we might be better off in all things considered perspective having 90% of students in public schools rather than 50% of students in public schools if that were the long-term outcome of insisting ever more strongly on the egalitarian ideal. Now, that seems to me a world of the design details and the trade-offs you make on the ground. So, I mean, as I say, I would never be presumptuous enough as a philosopher to say, but equality is still better. You should do that anyway. You know, I want to be sensitive to the all things considered perspective, and because I'm not on the ground, I don't have. You know, I'm relatively I'm not attuned to what the likely on the ground trade-offs and consequences, unintended consequences are likely to be from some particular intervention or another. I mean, this is the usual retreat the philosopher makes here. I'm trying to get some conceptual clarity. And it's not that I think this offers no guidance. It's that if someone told me, look, if we did what you just described, if we banned private tutoring and we forbade people from giving privately to their public school environment, and we insisted that everyone spend at the same level, and we had proficiency standards identical for everyone, what you're going to see, Rob, is that people are going to flee to prep schools, those who could afford it, and then we get even more, entrenched inequality of opportunity because the state is left private schools to do what they want. I say, well, that sounds pretty bad. I wouldn't, if I had to compare that outcome to what we have now, I might prefer it and still say I'm in favor of equality, and we have a real-world environment that appears to make it really difficult to push it forward. Again, there's no philosopher king impulse in me to say, but the ideal is so beautiful. Maybe.
So I've got a question that I think will be a little more back on your terms. So one thing that occurs to me is that I sort of have this creeping feeling that there's kind of a tipping point, right? And so up to a certain level, you really have to argue for adequacy. And it's not that kind of a luxury for advocating for equality. And so if we shift off of schooling for a minute and think about food and hunger, it doesn't really matter that there's a huge disparity between the amount of food I'm able to consume and how much Mira gets to consume.
Food consumption doesn't enhance positional competition.
Well, I think it's more that there's a basic number of calories you have to consume to be able to function properly.
Right.
And so the fact that there's, within a society, a huge disparity between the lowest and the highest doesn't really matter if 90% of people are starving. You have to address that 90%
Absolutely.
first.
Absolutely.
And so then, mapping back onto the educational issue, I think it gets tricky because I think a lot of people perceive, whether it's 90% or 50% starvation levels of education in so many places in the country. And so, how can you even worry about these gaps when you're not sort of hitting these very stark adequacy levels? But, I think a lot of other people see the glasses half full and say, well, yes, there are, some really inadequate levels of education in certain places. But, looking down the road, which I think is more sort of long-term, we do have these huge gaps, which I think are, can be equally. Anyway, I was just curious to get your thoughts.
So there's a certain part of me that's sympathetic to the idea of, what most morally commands our attention. And we want to look at those who are most desperately positioned. And in certain respects, that sounds an awful lot like we want to identify absolute deprivation, and the adequacy orientation is the appropriate one to make us concerned most about them. Now, I also want to say the equality ideal just as much is capable of focusing our attention on the worst off, because what we're comparing them to is how much worse off they are than those at the top end of the distribution. And so where's equality going to guide our attention? It's going to guide our attention to diminishing the unequal distributions of whatever the thing is, outcomes, opportunities, inputs.
I'm not sure I totally buy that, though, because going back to the starvation analogy, again, it doesn't really matter what the gap is. And so I'm not convinced convinced that the equity argument can focus as much attention so powerfully, because you are sort of focused on this gap as opposed to the fact that the inadequacy is just so bad as to be, in the starvation example, life-threatening, and pick your own adjective for sort of whatever the comparison is.
Okay, well, so two quick things. So one that I think directly addresses the point, and one that I'm going to try and pose a problem for the view, but it's a bit tangential. The first is that, well, let's do the second thing first. So if you're right that adequacy is going to be what most morally compels us to focus on the least advantaged, then for pretty quick to understand cosmopolitan Peter Singer style reasons, the worst off in the US don't look especially bad compared to the number of people globally who are far worse off and even are most disadvantaged. And perhaps for those reasons, even we here in the US ought to be more concerned about the most absolutely deprived, again, for those adequacy reasons, if indeed adequacy more compels us to focus on absolute deprivation than the equality ideal. And if that's the case, then we ought to be thinking about primary school opportunities for girls overseas in certain places rather than secondary school opportunities for poor kids in the U.S. And if you're happy with that, then at least there's some consistency there. But that seems to be one potential consequence of what you're saying. I've forgotten what the second point is now.
Anyways, I'll save you from it because we're after 5:30.
We're after 5:30. Okay, good.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.